All right, so now that we have our basic server set up, let's start implementing some of the endpoints for loading data. So we're going to start off by implementing the read endpoints, and then we'll move on to the others after this. Okay, so as I said before, there are going to be 4 main loading endpoints, one for friends, one for favorites, one for getting an individual friend's information by ID, and one for the user's profile data. Okay, so let's just create those right here, right now. They're all going to be get endpoints, and the path for them is going to be a little different. For the friends, we're literally just going to have it be app.get/friends. Okay, so when our front end wants to load data from here, it will send a GET request to localhost 8080/friends, and that will send back all of the friends inside our fake database here for now, right? Eventually, it will send back the actual friends from an actual database. Okay, now the callback for this is going to be request and response. And essentially all we're going to do for now is just send back this friends array to the client side. So that's going to be super simple. We're just going to say response dot, we'll say .json since we're sending back an actual JSON object. It just helps to set certain headers, that kind of thing. And we're going to put friends as the argument to that. Without databases, it's really quite a simple process to, build out these loading endpoints. Okay, so that's for our friends. Let's do our favorites now. For this one, we're going to say app.get, and the path for this one is going to be /favorites. And the callback for this one is going to be just as simple as the one for friends. We're going to say response.json favorites. Okay, so we're sending back this array up here. And next up, let's do our individual friend endpoint. This one's going to be a little more involved than the others, but it's still going to be fairly simple. We're going to say app.get, and the path for this one is going to involve URL parameters. It's going to be /friends, and then we're going to want to have the friend's ID that we want to load the data for be the next segment of this path. And the way that we do that in Express is by saying :friend ID. Okay, we can call this whatever we want. I'm just picking friend ID because that will basically make it clear what we're using that section of the URL for. And for the callback here, we're going to have to start off by getting this ID from the URL parameters. In Express, that's pretty easy to do. We're just going to say const friend ID equals request.params.friend ID. And we can simplify this as well by using object destructuring and just saying friend ID equals request.params. And once we have that friend ID, the next thing that we're going to do is use that to filter out the correct friend from our friends array and send that back to the client. So what that's going to look like, we're going to say const friend equals friends.find, and we want to find the friend whose ID equals this friend ID URL parameter. So we'll say friend.id is equal to friend ID. Okay, and once we have that friend, we're going to send that back to the client by saying response.json friend. And in situations like this, where we're trying to load a specific resource with a specific ID, it's usually a good idea to include some kind of logic for what should happen when the user is trying to load a resource that doesn't exist, right? If they're trying to load a friend using an ID that doesn't belong to any of the friends in our database, we want to let them know. Now, the way that we do this in Express and just in REST APIs in general is usually by sending back a 404 response code. Most people are familiar with this response code. It's the one that you see when you try and go to a page on a website that doesn't exist. It basically just means that whatever data you're trying to load isn't on the server, right, or in the database. So the way that we can do that here is friends.find. If there isn't a friend with that ID, friends.find will simply return undefined. So we can actually just check and see if this friend exists by saying if friend, then we want to send back response.json friend. Otherwise, we want to send back the 404 status code. And the way that we do that in Express is by saying response.sendStatus 404. And in situations like this, where we're just sending back 404, we usually don't need to send back any kind of response body. You can send back an additional message if you want. You would do that by saying res.status, and then you could say .json message couldn't find that person or something like that, but generally it's more than enough to just send back a 404 status code. Okay, so we'll say response.sendStatus 404. Now you might also be wondering why we would want to have both a friends endpoint for loading all of our friends and a friend/friend ID endpoint for loading individual friends. Well, at the point our app is at right now, it's still fairly small and we only have, maximum like 10 friends in our application at any given point in time. So there isn't really a pressing need for us to do this yet, but it is a good idea to have separate endpoints like this, because when we're listing our friends, okay, it's generally a good idea for performance reasons to only return the information you need, right? So for each of these friends, what we'll be doing when we actually use our database, we're just going to send back the information that the page needs. So we'll just be sending back their name, their age, and probably their ID as well, because that's all that's needed on the friends list page. This endpoint, on the other hand, we're going to use on the friend detail page, and for that page we need a lot more information, right? In addition to the information up here, we'll also need things like their interests, right, which is an array. We'll need their biography. We'll need basically all the other information that we put on each of the friend objects. And in an application with a lot more friends and a lot more information about each of our friends, we would definitely want to limit the amount that we load when we're listing them and, allow ourselves to get much more detailed information by sending a request to the individual friend endpoint. So that's why we have separate endpoints for these two things. And finally, the last read endpoint we're going to implement here is the one for user profile data. And for this one, we're going to say app.get. And the URL for this one is going to be /users/user ID. Okay, now the reason that we're including a user ID and we're not just having this endpoint be something like user profile, the reason we're not doing that is because right now, right, our app has one user and that's hard-coded into our database right here. However, as time goes on, right, and we make our app much more functional and, we add user authentication, that kind of stuff, as time goes on, we will have more users, so we'll want to allow ourselves to load those different users from this endpoint. And the way that we're doing that is in a pretty similar way to how we did our friends/friend ID. We're going to do /users/user ID. And for now, we're just going to be hard coding that user ID when we load it from the front end, because, the user ID is pretty clearly just 999 in our fake database here. But you'll see that later on when we add user authentication to this app, which we're not going to do for a little while, but when we do, you'll see that we'll actually use this user ID to load different information for different users that are logged in. So that's why we're doing things that way. Okay, and the callback for this one is going to look a lot like our friends endpoint. We're going to start off by getting the user ID. So we'll say const user ID equals request.params. We're going to say const user equals, well, for now, we're just going to say profile data, I suppose. So we're not actually even going to use the user ID right now, but we'll just leave it there for when we do need it later on. And after that, we're going to say response.json user. Okay, and if you want, actually, I'm going to do this because this just feels better. What I'm going to do is actually change this profile data in the fake database to a users array, and then we'll just put the same logic inside this endpoint as we did for friends. So we'll say user equals users.find, and we want the user whose ID is equal to friend ID, or user ID rather, that URL parameter there. Okay, and we're going to have to change this import up at the top to users as well. And we should do the same thing that we did here with our friend. We'll say if user exists, then we want to send this back. Otherwise, we want to send back a 404 status code. So we'll say send status 404. And this is currently a simplification, right? Because we're obviously not going to want users to be able to load other users' information. So at some point when we add user authentication to this, we'll have to actually go in and make sure users can only access their own information. But that's for later on, so we won't worry about it right now. For now, we're just going to do it this way. And those are all of the read endpoints for our server. You can check these out if you want by just opening up a browser and looking at the different endpoints. So we'll take a look at localhost 8080/favorites. And favorites is just an empty array for now, so it looks like that's working because that's what we specified in our fake database file. We can check out our friends. We'll see we get a lot of information there as well. Oh, and it looks like we're getting undefined here. We'll have to go back and fix that because that's an environment variable that we were using. And let's check out friends/ID. So we'll just do 123. Sure enough, we see that our friend 123 is there. And let's check out users as well. We'll do users/999. Hit enter. And sure enough, we see that our profile information gets sent back. All right, so let's go fix this undefined thing. This is in our fake database. We were using process.environment.public URL. We can still use that on our backend, but what we have to actually do is set that environment variable. Now, the way we can do this is by going into our package.json file and editing our dev script. So we'll do something like public URL equals, and we're going to set it equal to localhost 3000, because that's where we're currently storing our images for each of our users. Okay, and if we restart our server by saying npm run dev, it should actually set this public URL as an environment variable. And if we go back and refresh this, we should see localhost 3000 / myprofilepic.png. And we'll probably want to add HTTP to this as well, ://. Okay, so let's restart our server again just to make that take effect. And the reason we have to restart our server to make that take effect is because we're actually making changes to the script itself, right? We're not making changes to our server code. So again, just to make sure that that worked, we're going to refresh and we see that it now has the profile picture there. And that's all of the read endpoints for our server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.